Come and look at Technicolor. We are the rainbow people. We are the new people of a new South Africa.
The thousands of young people realize that it's not a question of protest, it is a matter of life and death here.
The kings and generals that make history, but the masses of the people, the workers, the peasants, the doctors, the lawyers, the clergy, all our people, I have seen them making history. Africa! Aiboye! Amandla!
By 1907, it had become quite clear that both the Boere and the Britons were agreeing to form one government over the whole of South Africa, but on the understanding that the Africans would be kept out of the franchise.
The 1910 Union Constitution dashed all hopes for democracy in the new South Africa. Appeals to the British Crown had failed. A new era in South African politics was to begin.
In 1910, the Africans were canvassing amongst themselves the formation of an organization which they regarded as a parliament for Africans, in contrast to the parliament which had been formed by the whites in 1910. And so the African National Congress was formed.
Africa.
had people like Dr. P. Kasem, Dr. John Dube, Dr. Hobusen. These were men who received their training abroad. And their conception of a political organizations was influenced by the policies of the countries where they were trained. British Parliament, American Congress, the Parliament in Holland, French Parliament.
The ANC leaders of the time were also influenced by their education in mission schools.
Now, there's an area in the Eastern Cape which I usually refer to as the bowl of learning. Loveday was already producing teachers and tradesmen who were trained in all the fields of building, printing, carpentry, and so on. It was from here, from those institutions, that teachers came out and spread to the other provinces.
It was this influential group that brought to the fore new questions about the ideals of non-racial society.
Right from the establishment of the political organization, the idea was an idea of one society, the people of South Africa.
The new Congress was tested by white determination to limit black access to land. The 1913 Land Act prevented African people from owning land or farming in all except the reserve areas. These were less than 8% of the country's land.
This was an act of dispossession. The act was, in fact, finalizing a process that had already taken place, because at the end of the wars of dispossession, the Africans had been driven back into the areas where, by 1910, they were, and where today they are as Bantustans.
The Land Acts legalized the outcome of 200 years of war between colonists and African tribes. The wars of resistance still burned in the national memory. Generations of ANC leaders had been inspired by the Bambata rebellion.
Well, precisely, that is why one of my grandchildren is called Bambata. Bambata is a very famous name, and his rebellion against white domination and the poll tax, and his collaboration with King Dinizulu is a very fascinating episode. The Bambata rebellion has inspired many freedom fighters.
The colonial authorities had imposed a new poll tax on the people of Natal. Bambata and his followers refused to pay. They fled to the forest and waged war on the government. By the end of the war, 4,000 Africans had died. The king was on trial for sedition and the Zulu people conquered. The authorities beheaded Bambata and paraded their trophy across the land.
My father was one of those who were involved, who fought in Nkandla Forest under the command of Skananda. But of special interest to me is that, according to the old chap, Bambata did not die at Nkandla. he disappeared in the forest and nobody knew where he died.
Bambata was killed, but if you killed Bambata, then people would be left in despair. So people always maintained Bambata wasn't killed to keep the idea of resistance on.
Here again, it was a question of land, a question of labor. Tax was introduced for the purpose of getting the people in the reserves to go and look for work in the areas, industrial areas. And therefore you see the pattern is the same right through. It is the pattern today. Land still plays a very important part today. It's one of the problems that we will face even when we do finally install the government of the people.
The 1913 Land Act had immediate and drastic consequences. ANC Saul Plaatje cycled across the veldt and found dispossessed families wandering, homeless in the land of their birth.
They said, it's winter in the Native Land Act. In winter the trees are stripped and leafless. This act seems like a one-edged sword. It cuts a big piece of the native and is very gentle with the European.
Plaatje led an ANC delegation to the British Crown, but their appeals for land were brushed aside.
The Land Act was very, very cruel to people because it made people to feel that they were no longer cared by the government, and the government was taking away the last thing they had, and that was the land. After the Land Act, all able-bodied people were forced out to go out and work.
The new gold mines on the Rand were hungry for cheap, unskilled labor.
This also links up with the migrant labor system. They were forced to go out to seek work outside the reserves. Then the law made it impossible for them to settle where they were working. It pushed them back.
They lived alone in single quarters, saving money to support their families on the crowded land.
In every town, there is a native license office. All natives coming into town must get a license. Here you see the men queuing up at the licensing office in Johannesburg. All natives must carry their license and show it on demand to a policeman.
Pass law was the most humiliating piece of legislation. You will see people lined up and everybody looked at them like the real criminals. And he's arrested for what? He isn't got a permit to be in Johannesburg. I have experienced several times the question of being stopped in the street and I'll ask for a pass. Sometimes the pass is left in a jacket. They're not concerned with that. They take you straight to jail. It was a terrible thing. If there's anything that made criminals of the African people, it was the question of the passes. And that is why the pass laws form the basis of our struggle.
The first people to resist the pass laws were women from the Orange Free State.
You now see that the women gave a lead, a remarkable lead, in fighting against the passes and going to jail. They inspire men in 1919. And men now began to resist in an organized way the passes.
Violent police action ended the pass campaign and led to serious conflicts in the ANC leadership.
those from the Transvaal now started talking more of action. But those who were following this Christian ethic were condemning that, and that it was going to bring no good results. So this was the beginning of the contradictions within the national movement itself.
Lord, I want to be more faithful.
In 1921, a religious group gathered on municipal ground in the Eastern Cape. Their prophet had foreseen the second coming of the Lord. Local farmers were enraged by what they saw as a Bolshevik land grab. Soon the government was demanding that the Israelites should move.
Kungokuba sahlala eNtabelanga legqithi ixesha esiye senze ngalo ngaphambili. Besiye ngaphambili siye nje sihlale eNtabelanga yakuphela iPasika simke. Kodwa ngoku siye sahlala eNtabelanga legqithe loxesha.
Like many other millenarian movements before and after, the leader of the Israelites preached that the millennium was about to dawn, and he had seen many signs of the coming of the millennium, one of which was Halley's Comet, which was sighted over South Africa around about that time. And in 1921, he preached to his followers all the themes of redemption, salvation, redemption from sin, redemption from bondage, the bondage of sin, and then the bondage of slavery. Very, very powerful and emotive themes.
The Smuts government brought in the troops who opened fire on the pilgrims.
Sangena ke ngoku saphumela sifeyisene nomkhosi. Satsawuba siphumela sifeyisene nomkhosi. Ukuvela kwethu baphela bonke abantu bethu. Saqabela ngaphezulu singabantu abathathu. Owayephambili ngulo wasalayo. Umdala uNkwekwe.
At the end of the day, nearly 200 lay dead on the plains of Bulhoek. Their white neighbors rejoiced.
Xa sifika eKomani sisangena kweli cala lingeneno laseWestbourne kwakuzele macalonke endleleni bonke emile benjenje besithi hure hure sangena eKomani sehla ngeKatkat Road. Sakufika ekupheleni kweKatkat Road zihamba ezonqwelo zinathi yonke ezokari bonke abenzakeleyo sawujika ezantsi senyuka ngeGriffith Street sawujika phezulu ngasestishi kusenziwa ishow nje ngathi sawujika phezulu ke ngokusabhekiswe hospital.
I was really outraged for so many people to be mowed down simply because they did not want to move from a particular place. If they were whites, I had no doubt that different methods of moving them away from that area would have been used. It deflated the prestige in which we regarded Smuts. And from that incident, I was never enthusiastic over him.
The 20th. In the towns, resistance was brewing. White South Africans were at the ready. The new class of black workers was finding its feet. During the First World War, the cost of living doubled, but the black miners' wages stayed the same. They could no longer support their rural families. It was time to strike. Skilled miners, many from Britain, rejected new technology which threatened to give their jobs to blacks. In 1922, they declared a general strike. Prime Minister Smuts called out the troops. There was fighting and shooting in the Rand town. After 4 days, the strikers were defeated. Across the land, a new black trade union was growing, the Industrial and Commercial Union.
They turned this ICU into a slogan in our old language. It means that I see you, white men, you have robbed us of our land. Then many people joined, they went to kettles and joined the ICU. My father was one of them. My father used to tell me that now we have joined this organization because we want to take over our land which we are robbed.
What began as a dock workers' union rapidly became a national political movement.
During the 1920s, with the rise of the ICU, I suppose one could talk of the urbanized African working class for the first time flexing its muscle and beginning to acquire a sense of its own strength and power, and perhaps a better appreciation of what the real relations of power were in the society.
ICU leader Kadali told workers, "Your bosses have a nice time of your labor which is cheap and abundant. You are sweating to make the white man's world a paradise, while you are condemned to live in hell. Their press is against us because we plan to eat the forbidden fruit at the center of the garden."
The ANC was overtaken by the more militant methods and the more able leadership of Kadali, but it was still now considered as too moderate.
The ICU swept across the rural areas like a veld fire, using unusual organizing methods. They sold a wild dream of redemption to a powerless people.
We were given yellow cards, and we were told that if one hasn't got the card, the Americans were coming and they are going to destroy, kill all the white people, and the black people will take over their land.
There was that idea that they were going to come in aeroplanes in order to liberate the black people.
If you didn't have this card on the top of your house on the day, then you would perish, because spears would descend from the sky and kill all those who didn't have these cards.
At its peak, the ICU had 100,000 members. But strike action was met with strong repression by the government and by white civilians. By 1929, white fear enabled Herzog to win power on a black peril platform. The ICU was in decline.
It was for a short time. I suppose that's why that someone describes it as like a veld fire. A veld fire doesn't last long. By the middle of the 30s, the ICU was waning.
During this period, the Communist Party began to Africanize. It called for an independent black republic.
One has to remember that the first political party in South Africa that struggled for democratic rights was the Communist Party. And the first political party were people of all races. could belong. And it became not a party of the few whites who had broken away from the Labour Party and formed the International Socialist League and later on in 1921 the Communist Party, but a party of African workers.
ANC's Josiah Gumede visited the Soviet Union. He returned saying he had seen the New Jerusalem.
Probably he was a bit rash. When I came back, he was president of the ANC then. He started telling them about what he saw and what a good thing it would be for South Africa. Then the chiefs were up in arms against him. You think my milk boy can sit together with me and tell me what to do? And they didn't like those people who were murderers who killed the king and the queen. So it became unpopular that he was unseated by the conservatives.
Fellow Afrikaners, if perchance today there is felt in South Africa a certain measure of anxiety, let it not be forgotten that there have been times of anxious care in the history of our fatherland, when by experience we learn to know that in South Africa there never is a night of storm not followed by a day of joyous sunshine.
I recollect very clearly that in the years of 32 to 34, with a serious drought that had afflicted large parts of the country, many families, Afrikaner families, trekked, if I may use this Afrikaans word, through Graaff-Reinet, either in an ox wagon or a donkey wagon, or even just with donkeys and with a few horses, or with a little cart, on their way to Port Elizabeth. The drought and the depression had forced them off the land, and they just came as they were, with the little belongings that they had.
Black communities were also devastated by the Great Depression.
The people were really hungry. I mean, there were soup kitchens established, not to the extent as it is now, very few. And there was poverty, and the people lived in shacks. And I tell you, during winter time, with the Cape rains and the cold winds, it was terrible.
We shall walk through.
Black and white people flooded into towns to sell their labor. But the Afrikaners could make no common cause with their fellow countrymen.
But the main reason was the whole way in which we were educated to see, the African community. Unconsciously, you saw that person to be a second-rate human being. And therefore, the values, the hopes, the demands, the rights and the dignities which you accorded and demanded for yourself, it never entered your head that they had the right, to be seen in a similar light. It was this, I think, tragedy of the Afrikaner people, but that we never really saw. That what was happening to us, that we could transplant it and say, but heavens, let's open our eyes. Look what is happening to them.
The ANC was raining on the people, emphasizing petitions and deputations. And the ordinary person could not lead such deputations because you needed someone who was learned, who could speak the language. The ordinary man couldn't. And the ANC became the organization of the learned.
Look, it was the hungry years, the depression, 1930, 31. People were hungry. There was no jobs.
While the white unemployed were demanding help from their government, black political organizations were in disarray. Torn by internal conflicts, the ANC had declined to just a handful of members. Hertzog's government was determined to remove the last vestige of democracy, the African vote in the Cape. The All-African Convention was formed to fight the bill. They sent a futile delegation to the Prime Minister under the leadership of Professor Jabavu.
They were not even given seats. The whole interview, they were on their feet. And when Professor Jabavu was asked to present the case, the situation was such that he did not even have the courage to look at Herzog, and he closed his eyes as he was talking to him. But Herzog treated our delegation very shabbily.
The Depression years had given momentum to the Afrikaner nationalist movement. The Broederbond was inspired to raise funds for the poor urban Afrikaner.
There was a sharing in which every Afrikaner family was asked to make a small contribution to the material welfare, to building up a little trust fund or some form of support for the Afrikaner people.
In 1938, they celebrated the 100th year of the Great Trek. Like their forefathers, they made the long journey from the Cape to Pretoria in Oxwego. The aim of the trek was to unite all Afrikaners.
They were sitting there saying, freedom, freedom, British Empire, freedom, British imperialist, freedom. But I didn't understand what type of freedom they were wanting. Otherwise, I could have sympathized with them if I knew that they want to be free. And what they were doing at that time is what we're doing now, which they arrest us and kill us for.
I think the 1938 track reenactment played a vital, I would say decisive role in the whole process of Afrikaner nationalism, leading eventually to the victory of the Nationalist Party in 1948. It became a massive upsurge of national pride, of the revitalization of all the old cultural and religious values of the Afrikaner people.
At the end of the trek, National Party leader Malan told his followers that it was now the duty of the Afrikaner to strive to make South Africa a white man's land.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
In October 1941, it was one of my friends who joined. I say, you are now a driver? He says, yes, I was very much interested in driving. Then I said, how much do you pay to drive? He says, no, it's free, they even pay you. You get money for learning to drive. So I was interested with the fear that the Germans were coming to kill us when they come here. I also joined the army. That was in 1941, October the 10th.
Black soldiers joined up in their thousands, fighting for freedom and democracy. The refusal to train them with firearms became a burning grievance.
They gave us guns, but they didn't show us where the trigger is, how to aim, which I've learned now, how to shoot. You just carry the gun and they tell us, you see the Japanese, they can fight from top, and the yellow people, and you are going to fight them. So they teach us nothing, absolutely nothing.
Back home, industry was rapidly expanding to meet the needs of the war. It drew in huge numbers of new workers, white women and black men.
At that time, most of the things came from England. The Battersby hat, which was the most expensive hat for good people, the type of Churchillian hat, it was a Battersby hat. Battersby, London, and most of the things, like the bicycles, also made in London. But during the war, it was not possible to have the things ordered from overseas, so that South Africa then started with the industrial. It was almost something like an industrial revolution.
Rural people flocked into the cities for wartime jobs. A new working class was in the making. The trade union movement revived, and the Communist Party was revitalized. Many of its members were active in the growing trade union. A new generation of black activists was coming to maturity.
We found stairways in Pretoria, stairways in Bloemfontein. The mood of militants developed throughout the country, and that had its big impact on the ANC, led to the formation of the Youth League, who came with new ideas. Although it was narrow nationalism, it was nationalism that wanted action.
They're on the warpath, these Bantu dancers, on the warpath to raise funds for the Victory Thanksgiving appeal. This effort to raise funds is a special one carried out by the non-European residents of Benoni.
Expectations were high. Black people were certain that war victory would bring them freedom.
Smart said the passes would be abolished. After the war, there will be no passes would be abolished.
Even John Smart have said that after the war, we'll get a better jobs and higher wages, and the pass law will be finished.
A large crowd gathers at the Durban docks to welcome home a contingent of 2,000 Springbok soldiers from the fighting front. In a Victory Day broadcast, General Smuts paid a tribute to the fighting nations of the world.
As we believe in God, let us, in our rejoicing and in our thanksgiving today, render thanks for the victory that is ours.
All people were very much disappointed. For instance, the whites were given houses, areas like that area of Terfontein and other places. But the blacks were only given bicycles. And they were given bicycles as a compensation, and they were very, very, very much disappointed. It was no more the talk of every freedom for every individual. It was quite a different thing.
Nothing was offered. Some of them, they were brave. They did very brave thing, and they got medals. And when they come back, they were given nothing. I personally went to some meeting of the ANC, and some friends went to organize. When they speak against the government. I said, now this is the right organization that I should join and fight these people, because we got nothing. And I think most of them went and joined the ANC because of that, or organized more people into the ANC to see that the only way through is to overthrow this very present government.
In South Africa.
Under a new leader, Dr. Xuma, the ANC was revitalized. A new democratic constitution was adopted. The old guard drafted their first charter calling for universal franchise, African claims.
That is one of the most important documents, even when you compare it now with documents like the Freedom Charter.
Well, it was really an important document at that time because it met more or less, but it did not go deep into the minds of the people because the people are generally disturbed by what happens to them daily. Like in a case of today, the people do respond to wages, housing. If you talk about freedom in general, I mean, it does give them something, but they want something that specifically affects them day by day.
A short way out of Johannesburg is Shantytown, mushroom city of rags and patches, poverty and squalor, which sprang up overnight as a new home for nearly 15,000 natives. The nucleus came from the neighboring native township of Orlando, which can be seen in the distance. In the manner of a biblical exodus, their leader, Sophozonkhe Mpanza, led the natives into the wilderness which became Shantytown. He led them from Orlando as a protest, he said, because there were not enough houses for all to live in. In some houses, as many as 10 people lived in one cottage.
The whole sea of Orlando Soweto today is in fact as a result of the work started by Mpanza. Even ANC was not fully behind Mpanza, but the Youth League was.
The whole Youth League, its stronghold was Orlando, where the squatter movement was taking place. And without there being any sharp differences between the elderly leadership and the Youth League, there was some difference in that this was something that was happening before our eyes. When we went to work, and from work, we passed through these squatter camps, and we couldn't avoid being interested. Dr. Xuma lived in Sofar Town, where there was a freehold and no squatter camps. And it was not a matter which was really a priority to him and the rest of the African leadership. They were concerned with broader questions throughout the country. We were concerned with the squatting movement, which was in our township.
Shanty towns sprang up across the country. Women formed the backbone of the movement. They had come to town to join their men, and they were determined to stay. The authorities were powerless to stop the squatters. The political organizations of the day were also unsure of this new movement.
It's difficult to imagine what particular directions they would have taken it in, because it was, in a sense, a movement of massive civil disobedience. And not just civil disobedience, which, with the prospect of it coming to an end at some point. The prospect was that if the authorities remained intransigent, it would go on, until one or other side became worn out.
After the Second World War, the Smuts government introduced new legislation to segregate the Indian community. The Ghetto Act restricted access to land and business rights. The Indian community declared a nationwide campaign built on their own tradition of passive resistance in South Africa. The new laws were deliberately broken.
So we were all arrested. So they took us to the police station and they kept the whole night there. Urine smell, I can't even sleep. It was such a terrible. And the next morning they brought us to the court. So we were, charged and then imprisoned for a month. When I went, my children were very small. So I just left my children like that. My youngest son was 18 months old when I went to prison. When I came back from prison, he didn't even know, he didn't want to come to me. I felt very hurt. But on the other end, I was very proud because I'm not sorry I went to jail because it's for a good thing we went. Isn't it?
The passive resistance campaign continued for over 2 years. People defied apartheid boundaries and crossed provincial borders. Over 2,000 went to jail.
Well, I was carried away by the feelings there. I must say that in all the years that we have been in the movement, I can't remember a single campaign which was as effective from the point of view of reaching out to the people as that was. One can say that it literally reached every Indian home so that people were mobilized.
I felt very bad that I was unable myself to do something similar. And I saw also families I knew went to jail not once but twice and others thrice. And they were able to teach us that a person could go to jail and come out alive and be prepared to go back again. Because during those days, in spite of the fact that we were in the struggle, to go to jail was something, that was a disaster. But the Indian community in this country taught us that you could actually challenge a power such as the government and still come out alive. It had that impact. It actually influenced the Defiance Campaign of 1952.
The passive resistance campaign cemented the growing non-racial alliance. The foundation for a decade of defiance was firm. The Smuts government was riding between the militant demands of the new urban working class and the fears of the white farmers and workers. The National Party presented voters with a vision of white supremacy.
The result of South Africa's general election is worldwide news. And the fact that Field Marshal Smuts, seen here on Table Mountain during the royal tour, has lost his seat has been a tremendous sensation.
We wake up one morning, we are told that Malan has won the election. And that meant that he shut the door on our faces.
Groot Schuur, the Prime Minister's residence in Cape Town, awaits the arrival of the newly elected Premier and his family. Following a handsome welcome at the railway station and a drive through the streets, Dr. and Mrs. Malan were in high spirits.
I was overjoyed, together with hundreds and thousands of Afrikaner people, because I had felt that in a very specific way, we had achieved the goal for which so many of us had worked for so many years.
D.F. Malan shouts, apartheid, apartheid. Keep them apart. Put the Kaffirs where they should be.
Comrade Oliver and I came out of Park Station that morning and bought a newspaper and learned that the National Party had won. And Comrade Oliver said, well, I like this because it is going to put further momentum to the resistance movement. We now know that we have an enemy in power and difficult days are coming for us. And I think that we're going to have a better opportunity of mobilizing our people.